So let me welcome everybody to a joint Retired Faculty Association, Staff Retirement Association Distinguished Lecture. We're trying to make this a monthly series all through the academic year. And today the title is The Presidential Transition 2020 to 2021. And our guest is Professor Robert Shrum. And Bob is the director of the Center for the Political Future and the Carmen and Lewis Warschaw Chair in Practical Politics in the Dornsife College. He's a legendary political strategist, and he was described as the most sought after consultant in the Democratic Party by the Atlantic Monthly. He served as a strategist in over 25 winning U.S. Senate campaigns, 8 successful gubernatorial campaigns, and numerous congressional campaigns. And his clients have included Edward Kennedy, Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Al Gore in the past. And if you're not familiar with the series of programs sponsored by the Center for the Political Future, let me encourage you all to participate. Those are wonderful. And let me introduce Bob Shrum, and perhaps he can tell us about the next program.
First of all, I'm happy to be back. I think it was 4 years ago that I talked to you. In fact, someone in the chat has already said my topic was who won the presidential election and why. And they asked who lost the presidential election and why should be what we talk about today. So I'll briefly mention that at the beginning. On Monday, related to that, the Center for the Political Future will have a conversation hosted by Mike Murphy, our co-director, on, it's called the 74 million voter question. Why did 74 million Americans vote for Donald Trump? It'll be at 5 p.m. on Monday. And by the way, in terms of all of our programs, you can always go to our website, the Center for the Political Future, and the programs are listed there. You can find out what's happening. We're going to do a couple of major conferences this spring, one on climate, which will go the whole week of Earth Day, and one on Biden's first 100 days on April 29th. I saw that this was called a lecture, and I prefer a conversation. So I'll talk for a while and then open it up to questions and observations. And what Jerry told me was you put the questions in the chat feature and then they can be asked. Jerry's going to ask them, someone else is going to ask them. Who lost the presidential election and why? That's an interesting topic, because you can imagine a different world, a world where Donald Trump last February said somebody just said, I think that the Monday talk was postponed until February 12th. That's quite possible, because we had a problem with some guests, but all you have to do is look on the Center for the Political Future and you can get all of those events. You can imagine a different world. You can imagine a world where last February, Donald Trump held a press conference and said, there is a very serious virus. It's broken out in China. We're going to do everything we can to keep it from coming to the US, but it will probably get here. People need to maintain social distance. They need to mask. They need to take all these health precautions. For that reason, I'm not going to hold any political rallies for the foreseeable future. I'm going to go to the Oval Office. I'm going to focus on doing everything we can to get a vaccine and to get all of the equipment that we need to protect healthcare workers and to protect the health of the population. And if he had done all of that and then let Dr. Fauci do the daily briefings, I think there's a good chance he could have been reelected. So who lost the presidential election? Trump. Why did he lose it? Because he did a bad job with one of the great crises of our time, which I'll mention again in a few minutes. The other thing, you know, he could have had after he lost, he could have conceded, engaged in a peaceful transition. And I think he'd be in a stronger place today. He is in a strong place with the Republican Party, but he'd be in a stronger place today with Americans in general. So I want to examine the two Americas that have been on display since November 3rd, and especially this past month. Trump's conduct between November 3rd and January 20th, and even before, did serious damage to our democracy and maybe lasting damage. When you think about the minority leader of the House saying the president had something to do with the events of January 6th and should be held responsible for it several weeks ago, encountering an enormous backlash and going down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss President Trump's ring, you know that democracy is not in as healthy a condition as it should be. And when you have QAnon members of Congress who are harassing kids who survived the Parkland shooting, who believe that the forest fire in California was caused by a Jewish laser beam from outer space, when you have that kind of stuff, and that person is put on the House Education and Labor Committee, I mean, it's extraordinary. So I think there's the fallout of this is pretty lasting. And I'll talk about how the boil might be lanced as I go along. The president ignored the COVID crisis in favor of the big lie that he won the election. In fact, he lost in the popular vote by the largest margin of any incumbent president defeated for re-election since Herbert Hoover in 1932. There is a parallel that Michael Beschloss and I were talking about the other day to what's happened with COVID. And that's what happened with the so-called Spanish flu in 1917, 18. They first discovered it in 1917. It hit like a tidal wave in 1918 and 1919. It actually started in Kansas at an Army base. And they told Woodrow Wilson and said, look, this is going to be a big problem. And he said, nothing can interfere with the war effort. We had just entered World War I. So we're not going to tell people about it. We're going to ship troops to Europe in what were called coffin ships, very close quartered ships where they were piled one on top of another. And we're not going to warn the rest of the world so they can take precautions. Over 600,000 Americans died in that pandemic, and over 50 million people died worldwide. And it started at an Army base in Kansas. As you all know, Trump's machinations culminated in a coup attempt on January 6th. And had it succeeded, American democracy would have been shattered. As Michael Beschloss said when we were in conversation the other day, thank God it was a coup organized by a brainstem, not a brain. It wasn't terribly well put together. But even after that coup attempt, you had 2/3 of House Republicans voting not to accept electoral votes. There was a lot of outrage, even among Republicans. It led to impeachment by the House. But Trump's hold on the GOP, it has become clear over the last several weeks, while it has slipped somewhat, is still very strong. Liz Cheney, who's a genuine principled conservative with whom I happen to disagree on a lot of issues, voted to impeach the president. And there's now a movement inside the Republican conference in the House of Representatives to depose her. And Republicans in the Senate, most of them, have tried to abort the Trump trial. The move failed 55-45 on the grounds of unity, quote unquote, or the argument that you can't impeach a president after he's out of office. Think about what that would mean. It would mean that you would have a license for lawlessness in the final months or weeks of your term, because there wouldn't be time to impeach you. And that's the only remedy you have when a president breaks the law or breaks his oath. I think Trump is unlikely to be convicted. His approval is down in the country to around 34%, but among Republicans, he has clear majority support. There are things that could change with that, but they rely a lot on what happens in the other America, the America of Joe Biden. But right now, you have Republican legislators in states trying to pass laws ramping up voter suppression. The most extraordinary one is in Arizona, which would allow the state legislature to nullify the results of the presidential election and award the electors to someone else, and would take away from courts the right to review election lawsuits on their own, and would say they had to hold a jury trial. I don't think that law would be sustained if it passes, and I don't think Governor Ducey would sign the law, but it shows you the extent to which voter suppression is going to become a bigger and bigger issue in the next couple of years. In Georgia, there's been a law introduced in the state legislature that you would have to send a photostat of your state issued ID, your birth certificate, your driver's license, your passport twice in order to get an absentee ballot. So you're going to see more of that in reaction to what happened in November. Let's talk about that other America, Joe Biden's America. Think about his transition. He didn't engage with Trump. He acted as if he had been elected president of the United States, which he had been. He was calm. He was reassuring. He went about making his appointments and preparing a host of executive orders. I don't know what you thought of the inauguration. I thought it was an amazing event, given all the limitations that were there because of COVID. It was actually the impresario in charge of it is my former colleague, Stephanie Cutter, who was deputy campaign manager for Barack Obama, but had been Ted Kennedy's press secretary and John Kerry's press secretary in 2004. I thought Biden himself delivered the best inaugural address I've heard since 1961. Now, what did he mean in that speech by his call to unity? He didn't mean that we won't disagree, but what he was trying to argue is that we had to stop treating politics as an all-out war. We had to have some mutual respect. If you lose the game, you don't burn down the stadium. That brings me, which is almost what happened in America on January 6th. That brings me to the preeminent challenges, the two great and immediate tests for the Biden presidency. COVID relief, the vaccine, and economic recovery. Biden was not dealt an easy hand here, either in terms of a vaccine supply and distribution system, which is in disarray and they're fixing it, or the obstacles to passing his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. It is, I think, becoming increasingly clear that Republicans will filibuster that package. And as a result of that, I think the package will pass. I don't know that it will be exactly 1.9. It will pass by a process called reconciliation, which many of you may be familiar with. I'll just describe it in brief. Once a year on matters having to do with spending and taxation, Congress can pass a reconciliation bill, and it's filibuster proof. In the Senate, it only requires 51 votes. So that means that to do it this way, Biden would have to hold almost every Democrat in the House and the Senate. There might be one or two Republicans or a handful of Republicans who would vote for it, but I wouldn't rely on that. I think Biden has to say, we have to hold the Democrats. And he's lucky in that, in one respect. Nancy Pelosi is probably the most masterful Speaker of the House in a long time. and I suspect she will hold her House members together. And Chuck Schumer so far has demonstrated some real skill in dealing with Mitch McConnell, and you need skill in dealing with Mitch McConnell. By the way, for those of you who don't know it, Mitch McConnell started out as a kind of liberal Republican. He worked for
USC.
I'm sorry, I don't know what he worked for. John Sherman Cooper, who was a Republican senator from Kentucky, who was one of the leaders in the Senate to stop the Vietnam War. So that's where he got his start. He's come a long way since, and you need a lot of skill to deal with him, because whatever you may think of him, he too is a master of the process in the Senate. And so far, Schumer's done pretty well at handling this. The bill will contain economic support, probably $1,400 more in checks to top those checks up to $2,000, extended unemployment compensation, substantially more resources to speed up vaccinations. And the president wants, in fact, to use the armed forces to help administer the vaccines. They're going to set up federal vaccine centers, and more help for state and local governments, many of which are very hard pressed. Ironically, by the way, California is not hard pressed because of our reliance on the income tax, which can sometimes hurt us. The people in Silicon Valley and wealthy people in general, of whom there are a lot in California, have made so much money during the past year, despite the pandemic, that the state actually is going to end up with $22 billion more than they thought they would. So California is not in that kind of deep trouble. The one thing he may not be able to do in reconciliation is raise the minimum wage to $15. That will be a parliamentary question. It will be argued. We'll see what happens. Now, Democrats are not only likely to go this route, Biden said as much this morning. And what he said was, look, we got to have this package, no ands, ifs, or buts about it. And if we have to do reconciliation, we will. That may push some Republicans in the direction of trying to cooperate, but you got to get 10 of them in the Senate. And I don't think he'll make the mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was not the only choice. Obama could have done his economic stimulus through reconciliation, but he chose to really push a bipartisan approach. But to get to 60 votes, he had to settle for a package that was too small. And therefore, the recovery from the financial crisis in 2009, 10, 11 was slower than it should have been. Now, why does McConnell seem so intent on trying to block whatever Joe Biden wants to do? I think you have to go back to what he said in 2009, that leaked out, said it to a meeting of Republicans, that his number one objective was to see to it that Barack Obama could not be reelected, and he would do everything he could to prevent the president from being a success. And I think that is true in this situation, whether Biden runs again or whether it's a different Democrat. Kamala Harris would certainly be the favorite for the nomination. I think that the focus on getting the Senate back under Republican control, the House back under Republican control, and the presidency in 2024 is his primary consideration in all of these calculations. Now, it may not work. If the Biden administration can get shots in enough arms, you're going to see the economy take off in a very serious way. And I think that's part of what's happened in the stock market. The notion that we're going to do that is priced into a lot of these indices. 69% of the public in the latest poll approve of how Biden is handling his COVID response. But he's got to make it work. He's got to, we have to, by the time we get to the summer, we have to have vaccines really available for people. so that they're not frustrated standing in line, so that we can begin by the fall to open up. And if we can do that, then I think you'll see real growth in jobs, real growth in incomes, and a country that feels much better about its future. If that happens, it is possible that the Biden political operation will succeed in defying conventional wisdom about the midterms, which is that an incumbent president in his first midterm loses a lot of seats. Hasn't always happened. 1934, Franklin Roosevelt; 1962, JFK; 2002, after 9/11, George W. Bush. Their parties did not incur that kind of loss. So you could actually see the Democrats hold on. The other thing that could happen, I think, is that you could begin to break the fever gripping the country. And that 34, 33% approval rating that Trump has, maybe get it down to 30, 28, because unity doesn't mean that we're all going to agree all the time or that people are not going to be alienated. But long term, I think this is likely to be a fraught period because a third of America will be alienated and angry. A lot of people are traumatized by the changing demography of the country. We are becoming a majority non-white society, and that's inevitable. There's an element of racism here. There's also an element of people just saying, where did my country go? And they have in their heads an imagined 1950s that was a wonderful time. Well, it was a wonderful time for some people, and it was a terrible time for lots of other people. And secondly, you have people alienated because globalization has hollowed out a lot of rural areas and small towns in this country. And one thing I think the Biden administration will do, and I think they'll talk about it, is direct a lot of economic relief to those places. For example, you can create incentives, tax incentives, for companies to move in there, and you can use community colleges to help prepare people to work for those companies. The fraughtness and the sense of almost crisis in our democracy is complicated by our electoral system, which has a built-in advantage for smaller, redder states. Think of the Electoral College. The estimate that Nate Silver has is that a Democrat has to win by more than 4 million popular votes, because at 4 million, that Democrat would have just a 50% chance of taking or keeping the White House. Secondly, we have a Senate which gives as much representation to a state like Wyoming, which has about 500,000 people and only one member of Congress, as it does to California, with over 40 million people. And in fact, if you apportion senators by the vote, the number of voters in each state, Democrats would have a very substantial margin in the Senate. So that's one thing that complicates this. Something else is, I think that the whole crisis of racial justice, which some people can't seem to come to terms with. I mean, we literally have members of Congress who tweeted out racist tropes or agreed with them. Income inequality, which is related to what I was talking about before in terms of globalization, and climate change. But on the other side of the political ledger, the Republican Party, as long as it remains Trumpified, is marching into a demographic cul-de-sac. It's even losing grounds in the suburbs, many of which Biden carried. In fact, if you think about it, since the Trump election in 2016, Republicans lost governorship, the gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia. They got shellacked in the midterms. They have lost the Senate, amazingly, because of a vote in Georgia, which elected 2 Democratic senators, and Biden carried the state. And long term, unless they succeed at massive voter suppression and we actually don't let people vote for president. We let state legislators, gerrymandered, vote for president. The Republican Party is in deep trouble. I think historians will look back on this transition and on the attempted coup and conclude that Otto von Bismarck was right when he said in the 19th century, God has a special providence for fools, drunkards in the United States of America. I'm hoping that in the years ahead, that providence holds, that it continues, and that we don't lose the system that for 200 years, imperfect as it is, has made this country a democracy which is on a journey to perfect its union. All of that said, I think I'll shut up and answer some questions if anybody has any.
Well, I see a question here about whether Congress might have a better chance to censure Trump rather than complete the impeachment process.
Yes, it would. Congress, there would be a majority in the Senate to censure Trump. I have no doubt about that. You don't need 60 votes. You can't filibuster it. So I think you could get a censure, and you might even get 60 votes. Although you do have members of the House and Senate, Republicans, who are literally fearful of physical violence if they cross Donald Trump. They're also fearful, of course, of primaries. I mean, Liz Cheney, who's as Republican as you can get in the truest sense of that word, is going to clearly face a primary in Wyoming, which she could lose because she voted to impeach the president and said he incited an insurrection against our democracy. So, yes, I think you get the censure. Now, why then do impeachment? I think it's for the reason I suggested earlier, that you don't want to say, in effect, that presidents have a license to do anything. And in their last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, no matter how lawless, and then once they're gone, you can't do anything about it. Now, Trump did not pardon himself, and he did not trust Mike Pence to pardon him, which, I don't know that Pence would have done it. Pence is another person with whom on issues I would deeply disagree, and no one was a bigger fan of Donald Trump's than Pence. But when the president got to the point of asking him to violate his oath of office in the Constitution, he said no, he would not do it. He would not throw out electoral votes. So the other remedy, and Trump may face this, by the way, and it's one of the reasons that I think he may not run in 2024 and try to pull a Grover Cleveland, is that there's a legal process going on in the Southern District of New York at the federal level. There are investigations at the state level by the state attorney general in New York, by the district attorney of Manhattan, Cy Vance, and he may face a host of legal troubles. And he no longer has the protections that he had when he was president. He actually at one point tried in this lawsuit that the woman that he assaulted filed against him. He tried to say, well, I can't be sued because I'm president of the United States. The courts did not agree with that. But he faces all of that and financial complications with banks saying they're not going to do business with him anymore. And the PGA saying we're not going to play golf, have one of our tournaments at your course. And one of the things nobody's noticed, by the way, is the Royal and Ancient, which puts on the British Open, has also said they are not going to hold the British Open at any Trump-owned property. So censure would be easier, and we may end up there, we may not.
Okay, I'm going to ask, all of a sudden we're getting lots of questions. Thank you, guys. This is an international question that I thought was interesting from Karen Koblitz. And she says, we have lost our major standing in the world. How do we regain respect for America? Will there be trust in our government with the fear in 4 years it will change?
Well, we've gone a substantial number of miles back toward regaining trust simply by the results of the election. If there have been there's been some polling in foreign countries showing suddenly that respect for America and trust in America has gone up. I don't think those folks necessarily understand how close we came to a second term for a president who was defeated by 7 million votes, in which case trust would utterly collapse in the United States. Biden has been talking with the leaders of other major Western nations and other major powers, emphasizing that he wants to rebuild our alliances. We've rejoined the World Health Organization. He called Putin and said, you know, the arms control treaty that Trump wanted to dump, I want to keep it. Will we renew it for 5 years? Putin agreed. And he then told Putin that we were very unhappy about what's happening with the opposition leader Navalny. We're very unhappy with Russian bounties on what's going on in Afghanistan, and that we're going to do something about it. Now, that part's complicated because, as we know, we had to put up during the Cold War with we had to make agreements with the Soviet Union, even while profoundly disagreeing with a lot of what it was doing internally. So I think Biden will do that. And I think he will launch, once we get the COVID crisis here under control, I think he will launch a major effort, probably in conjunction with some of our NATO allies, to see that we get vaccines to the less developed world. It's nutty, by the way, to think we should all just vaccinate ourselves and then say, that's it, we're fine. We're not fine, because if COVID rages across Africa, rages in parts of Asia and Latin America, then we're going to be living with that epidemic or pandemic for a long time, and it's going to come back here. So it only costs about, I think Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of Britain, figured out that it cost about $30 billion to get vaccines to all these countries. And we ought to get the vaccines there. And we ought to spend the money, because it's not only morally right, it's in our self-interest. So I think Biden will do a lot to restore trust. We've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. I think he sent a very powerful signal by appointing John Kerry to be his climate envoy. They're good friends. And he's appointed very competent people to national security positions. And he'll listen to them. I mean, you know, there's a story, I guess it's true because it's now been told by a number of different people who work for Trump, that when you briefed him, it was better if you had pictures like a comic book than if you had, you know, paragraph after paragraph about what was happening in the world, that he would lose interest. So if you had photos or drawings, he would pay attention.
We have a very thoughtful question from Diane Wallace having to do with the blockage of access to key information from the departments of the federal government and the authorization by the General Services Administration for funding and office space so that the transition could take place or begin for the new administration. Are there any ways you think that Congress can address those delays prior to this Congress authorizing the outcome of the election?
I hope I can give a thoughtful answer to a thoughtful question. The first priorities for Biden, as I said, have to be COVID and the economy. That's top of mind for everybody in this country. And when you look at Dodger Stadium and you see people waiting hours in line to get a vaccine, you know it. The coup didn't just happen. The coup attempt didn't just happen on January 6th. That was a culmination of something that started before the election, when Trump wouldn't say he would accept the results of the election if he lost, when he was saying that mail-in ballots were inherently fraudulent and discouraging his own people, by the way, from voting by mail-in ballots. He knew what he was doing. He knew he would have, if they all voted on election day, he'd have a big lead when votes were first counted, because some states like Pennsylvania said you can't start counting the mail-in ballots until after the polls have closed. So the first ballots that got counted in Pennsylvania were same-day ballots. And as a result, Trump had a lead, I think 400,000 in Pennsylvania, maybe bigger than that. The GSA not cooperating was part of the coup attempt. Withholding information was part of the coup attempt. You know, bringing that crowd to Washington and having them invade the Capitol and 5, now 6 people lose their lives. And, you know, and the damage, some of the damage was extraordinary. And Mitt Romney, by the way, has suggested that some of the damage not be repaired, that a few places be left the way they were to remind people of what happened. I think you can do a number of things. First of all, you could transfer the power to trigger the transition to someone independent, who's not just a presidential appointee beholden to the president. I mean, he put a political hack in charge of the GSA and she did his bidding. So you could have the transition triggered in a different way. Secondly, and I didn't mention this in my talk, you know, the notion that you can't prosecute a president while he's in office is actually not in the Constitution. It's not in the laws. It's an advisory opinion written by the Nixon Justice Department back in 1973. And I think you could at least attempt to change that and say that just like anybody else, if a president commits a crime, he can be indicted, that impeachment is not the only remedy. But we also have to recognize that even if you do those things, a lot of American democracy depends on norms, not laws. And if you have a totally unscrupulous person who is perfectly happy to break those norms, shatter those norms, then you're always going to face the kind of threat that we faced in earlier this month.
Okay, I've got 2 questions that are similar from Cami and Katie, and these have to do with, other than impeachment, is there another process to make sure Trump does not continue to receive top secret military intelligence and national security reports? Many people are especially concerned that he's not capable of keeping the sensitive information to himself, may purposefully or accidentally leak it to our advisors, to our adversaries rather. And Katie says something similar. Do former presidents still get daily briefings of national security? If so, how do we keep Trump from getting those and giving them to people he sees as friends and foreign powers?
They don't, former presidents don't have an inherent right to those briefings. So, you know, the Biden administration could decide that those briefings should not be given to Trump. And I suspect that they will. Now, as I said earlier, he didn't pay much attention to them anyway, but I also think that he doesn't have much of a filter. If you tell him something, he might very well regale his guests at Mar-a-Lago with it over dinner. So, you know, you can cut him off, and I hope they do.
Okay.
We have a question from Bill Gibbons. Essentially, whether Trump might continue to be legally liable for the telephone calls to officials in Georgia attempting to change the vote.
Sure. I mean, that was a violation of Georgia law. And I think the Fulton County District Attorney is investigating it, since that's where the call came in to Fulton County, to the Secretary of State. So he could be legally liable for that, as well as all the other stuff that I mentioned earlier. He could be legally liable for example, for trying to get Arizona to change its vote count. I mean, you know, when he said to Brad Raffensperger, someone we never heard of a year ago, but who's now become famous, Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, who said, look, I can't violate the law. Biden won the state. But when he said to him, come on, it's not so hard. Do me a favor. Just go out and find 11,800 votes, which was just like one vote more than he needed to carry the state. So yeah, I think he could very well be indicted for that too. I suspect his legal bills will be substantial in the next several years.
Okay, we've got another question from Grace. It says, what are your thoughts on adding seats to the Supreme Court, adding Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as states?
As a matter of right, we clearly ought to have Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as states. One of the great advocates, by the way, for Puerto Rico becoming a state was Ronald Reagan, who thought that it was completely anomalous to have millions of people living in American territory who had no right to vote for president and had no one representing them in Congress. They have a delegate, but the delegate can't vote. Can it be done? I think it will be difficult. You know, most Republicans won't vote for it because they believe and fear that it means that you'll get 4 more Democratic senators, 2 from the District of Columbia and 2 from Puerto Rico. And I don't know that you would get all 50 Democrats plus Kamala Harris to vote for it. And even if you did, you face the threat of a filibuster. At which point, you know, right now, 2 Democrats, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin from Arizona and West Virginia, say they don't want to get rid of the filibuster. Well, if you don't get rid of the filibuster, then it's very, very hard to do that. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Adding seats to the Supreme Court.
I think a lot of Democrats would oppose that. I think it only becomes a more palatable and likely option if the court does crazy things, like totally violate precedent, you know, overturn some big decisions. You know, I think if, for example, and I think John Roberts understands this, if the court ever overturned Roe v. Wade, then I'd say all bets are off. And, you know, that would take the culture wars in this country to a level of enormous intensity. Now, Pete Buttigieg, I thought, had a really thoughtful proposal during the campaign, which was that Supreme Court justices would have 18-year, non-renewable, staggered terms, so that you couldn't have any one president, you know, packing the court. But to get that through Congress, that would be very tough proposition. And by the way, there's no magic in 9. The court has had 5 members, 7 members, 10 members, 9 members since the late 1860s. But I think we ought to admit Puerto Rico, and we ought to admit the District of Columbia, which, by the way, has considerably more people in terms of population than a number of states. We ought to admit them as states, and you know, maybe it will happen someday. You know, what blocked Hawaii for a long time was, frankly, racial prejudice. A lot of Southerners did not want to let Hawaii into the Union, and it only happened because of a deal that also admitted Alaska at the same time. By the way, on the assumption that Alaska would be reliably Democratic and Hawaii would be reliably Republican, and therefore it wouldn't change any balance in the Senate, when in fact it's turned out to be exactly the other way around.
Okay.
We had a question from Catherine Shirley. Are there any elements to Trump's initiatives that are worthy of maintaining?
That's a tough question, because when I think of Trump's initiatives, I think of locking children up in cages, leaving the Paris Climate Accords, trying to destroy a bipartisan tradition of arms control that goes all the way back it runs from Eisenhower and Kennedy through Nixon, Reagan, George W. Bush. And the trade war with China has been handled so clumsily that it's probably hurt Americans more than it's hurt the Chinese. And the preliminary agreement the Chinese made, they're not living up to. So Biden's going to have to do something about that, but I don't think he has to do it in a Trumpy way. God, I'd like to think of something. President Eisenhower, when he was asked during the 1960 campaign, a reporter at a press conference said, "Mr. President, Richard Nixon is running on experience counts. Can you name one recommendation or suggestion that he's made that you adopted?" And Eisenhower replied, "If you give me a week, I might think of something." If you give me a week, I might think of something. I don't want to be overly partisan here. There has to be something Trump did that was good. Well, I'll tell you what you could build on. The Justice Act, criminal law reform, and not holding people in prison for nonviolent offenses. It didn't go nearly as far as it needed to go, but you could build on it. So it didn't take me a week. It just took me 3 or 4 minutes to think.
Okay, I've got a question from David Belson, which he asked twice because he was the first person to ask a question. Sorry, David. And a couple of people asked something similar. He says, wouldn't Biden's agenda be easier or faster to move forward if Trump's impeachment or censure was dropped?
Yes. Although I think the postponement of the trial until February 8th, I think you could see Democrats move very fast if they decide to use reconciliation, and you could get a very big COVID relief and vaccine bill through. But I go back to the basic thing that I said earlier. What kind of message and precedent would it be to say that the President of the United States could attempt to frustrate the results of a free election, grant himself a second term, and in extremis use a mob to create insurrection against the Congress, and then let that person off scot-free? I think it would send a very bad message. I don't think Democrats, by the way, in particular, really wanted to pursue impeachment. I think they thought they had no choice.
Yeah. Jerry, you have something?
Well, we have an amusing question from Dixon Johnson. Can you imagine what Trump's presidential library will be like?
I could give an amusing answer,
Please do.
comic books, everything done graphically. But I assume he'll raise the money and build a library. I don't know where, I don't think the city of New York wants it. I'm not sure that he could put it in Palm Beach. I don't think they would want it. But somewhere, and I don't think the University of Pennsylvania would take it, which is where he did his last 2 years of college. He says, I went to the Wharton School, the finest school in America, et cetera. He did his first 2 years at Fordham, and then his father gave a substantial donation to Penn, and he did his last 2 years at Penn.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, we were two. Oh, there's one from Dixon, and I know that Dixon asked the question, Dixon Johnson, but this is about immigration reform. As an immigrant, I'm always fascinated. How likely is immigration reform, especially with regard to undocumented long-term residents?
I think it's going to run into a big wall of resistance from Republicans. And as long as the filibuster exists, I think it would be very difficult to get through the Senate. There's a lot that Biden can do and has been doing with executive action, for example, on the DACA kids. But, you know, comprehensive immigration reform, the last time we really got it was in the 1980s. And it was Ronald Reagan working with Ted Kennedy to create amnesty and a path to citizenship for what were then thought to be 3 or 4 million undocumented people. Now you've got 11 or 12 million, maybe more. And I think ultimately we will get there. I think in the immediate future, given the margins in the Senate, especially that, and the filibuster rule, that it's not going to happen right away. Although President Biden sent the bill up to Congress in his first week in office.
Okay. Jerry, did you want to ask
Well,
one?
one more clarification. Could you tell us once again whether filibuster can be outlawed as a rule in the Senate by a majority vote?
Yes, it can. You would, when the Senate organizes itself at the beginning of each session, and by the way, the organizing resolution has not been passed yet. First, McConnell wanted a promise that the Democrats would never change the filibuster. He couldn't get that. Now he's fighting over some other details. But that organizing resolution cannot be filibustered, and it can set the rules of the Senate. So McConnell, for example, in the organizing resolution, when he was in control, abolished the filibuster for appointments to the Supreme Court. Harry Reid abolished the filibuster for appointments to executive agencies and the lower courts. And that's why Alexander Mayorkas is going to get confirmed to the Department of Homeland Security, because there was Republican attempts to block it, but Schumer filed a cloture motion to cut off debate, and it only requires 51 votes. It actually got more than that. It got a number of Republican votes. So yes, it can be done. It would require, I think, a lot of frustration on the part of Democrats, because the filibuster was being used routinely and over and over and over again to try to block action. And then maybe you would get a Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema to favor abolishing it. By the way, there are a lot of Democrats who think that it should be kept for legislation. You know, I think Pat Leahy believes that, although he might vote to get rid of it because of the circumstances. And their argument is that it forces people to compromise. Well, we're a hell of a long way away from the days when Reagan would sit down with Tip O'Neill and come up with a bipartisan plan to save Social Security, or sit down with Ted Kennedy and come up with a bipartisan plan on immigration reform. We just moved a long way away from that. We have very bitter politics. Biden would like to do something about that. And I think he'll try once we're past this $1.9 trillion COVID bill, assuming that he can get it through on reconciliation.
Well, let me thank you, Bob, once more for coming to join us. And I hope that we can persuade you to join us perhaps in 2 years again, rather than 4.
Sure.
To discuss the midterm elections.
Sure, I'll do that. Listen, you guys all gave a huge amount to the University of Southern California, and the least I can do is come back and talk to you when you want me. And you know, anyway, thank you all very, very much, and I'll see you again.
And bless your heart. Thanks again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I want to tell you, we had 103 people in this meeting, which is remarkable. And so what I would like to do is take this chance to tell you all about our next Retired Faculty Association Staff Retirement Association Distinguished Lecture. It's going to be February 26th at noon again. We will be hearing from Stephen Chen, Associate Dean for Clinical Affairs at the School of Pharmacy. I think right now we're all kind of worried about health, right? Kind of worried about inoculations, kind of worried about all that pharmacists can do for us. So he will be speaking to us.
Cap Stanley or Cap Stanley.
Sorry, guys. And so he will be speaking to us on the 26th. We'll be getting the invitation out to you in the next couple of weeks. So I really hope you can join us. We had the greatest participation with questions, and a lot of people are saying, great, you know, wonderful, thank you, outstanding program, great session, learned so much, been so great, etc. So yeah, feels good to be appreciated, and we had a wonderful speaker. So Terry, any parting thoughts?
Well, thank you for joining us and encouraging us to keep this distinguished lecture series going on in the foreseeable future.